people would be better off listening to the panel than me. So I have essentially one observation, which is that this panel grew out of the observation that economics is a strongly hierarchical field. It's like the court of the Mikado, or maybe, this is probably unfair to the Egyptians, ancient Egypt. It's, you know, it's structured with departments, with journals, and then vast numbers of folks at various levels. But, you know, in 2008, this process that was supposed to certify things as scientifically sound, the best thinking, etc. You all know, you hear this stuff all the time. Completely failed, or nearly so. I mean, there wasn't one doctrine that went down, it was a whole chain of them. And so we thought, it might be good if INET looks into what's the story here. Can you actually, what can you say about the way this structure functions? Can you actually prove it functions the way you think it does? And at some point, somebody will want to ask the question, so how does this actually work to certify things if they go so badly awry? What happened? And so we commissioned a string of papers, then we're delighted when George and Jim and the other Nobelists said they'd help out in this. So we're just gonna do the panel, and George is gonna speak first.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so now,
12 minutes.
Let's see whether we get some slides. We got a slide.
They got it.
I don't know whether I did that or somebody else. Okay, so Sins of Omission, that's my title. Okay, so there's a general problem in economics. That problem develops out of what I consider a misconception of the field. So there's an almost universal view amongst economists that economic research is about applying scientific method to economic and social problems. Now, I have no beef with that. But then economists have further views regarding what scientific method means. It is commonly interpreted as meaning the application of simple models and statistical analysis, as in physics. Economists who have adopted this methodology have made excellent contributions, so they are to be praised. But it is also true that such exclusionary definition of methodology leads to a dangerous multitasking problem. It incentivizes attention on problems that are easy to pursue with the exclusionary definition, and it de-incentivizes attention away from problems that are difficult to pursue. So let me do a brief summary of what I've said so far. Economists have an almost universal view that simple modeling and statistical analysis are the full domain of economic research. As a result, there will be economic or social problems that are outside the domain of economic research. Okay, so now let me give you some motivation. So in this afternoon's session, I'm going to talk about sins of omission with regard to motivation. Let me give you a snap preview of that. Economists have their standard ways to present motivation. So we make models based on a priori assumptions. For example, consumers are maximizing utility, firms are maximizing profit, and then behavioral economics allows some small deviations that. But the fact is, analysis of many economic problems require a broader view of motivation. In this broader view, what motivates people are the stories. They're the stories that people are telling themselves at the time they are making their decisions. So just think about it. That view of motivation is central to sociologists. So sociologists think that these stories have a much wider and richer range than what's implicit in economists' a priori assumptions. Okay. So that's why the core of sociology is ethnography. Ethnographies empirically uncover. They uncover people's stories. They can also uncover the social networking that generates those stories. So this afternoon, I'm going to give 5 examples in which such stories play a central role. Economists' restricted range of stories and their consequences is one major example of sins of omission that result from a narrow view of economic research. So if you want to see solid evidence about this and the fact that economists have a narrow view, solid evidence that sociologists and economists have different analyses to many economic problems can be seen. There's a wonderful YouTube of Ann Swidler's brilliant Sociology 1 course, and it's fun to watch, okay? And now, if you look at that, you'll see that there's surprisingly little overlap, almost none, between her treatments and those in a standard economics textbook, such as, for example, Mankiw, which is a very good book. So economists' restricted range of the stories that people tell themselves when they make their decisions is the major reason for this difference. So that's my first example, the fact that economists don't look at this wide range of stories. Let me give you a second example of sins of omission. Now, you may or may not agree with what I'm going to say now, okay? But we can see. The Queen of England famously asked, as probably you all know, on a visit to the LSE, why economists had not predicted the financial crisis of 2008. So Raghu Rajan has said that would have required detailed knowledge of theory and institutions in the disparate subfields of finance, real estate, and macroeconomics. This also agrees with Ricardo Caballero's analysis, which is seemingly different regarding why macroeconomists failed to see the crisis. So Caballero divides macro models into what he calls core and periphery. Now, he says the core is a DSGE model. So this model chooses simple a priori assumptions at many nodes of modeling choice. So, for example, it's a neoclassical growth model with technology shocks, consumption and leisure determined by maximizing intertemporal utility, investment and hiring decisions determined by intertemporal profit maximization, and rational expectations by consumers and firms. So it's the whole hog. So there is, in fact, and there was, in fact, a considerable macro and finance literature that is peripheral to this core. That periphery explores deviations from the core, but only one at a time. So Caballero explained why that was the case. The periphery, so here's this sentence, the periphery is about isolating specific mechanisms. Therefore, it surrounds the sources of these mechanisms with assumptions designed to kill unwanted effects that would pollute the message. But the financial crisis involved interactions that would not be one at a time deviations. So a model that incorporated such deviations was therefore outside the range of permissible research. Now that explains why our theories in fact could not predict the crisis, even though actually when you go back and read it, they're just fantastically good, because you look at each of the individual elements and they're very good papers on this. Now, it's also true that a statistical approach wouldn't work. Okay? So the needed forensic information that could have been available would not be statistical. So again, it would be outside the range of permissible economic research. So implicitly, Raghu Rajan, in his 2005 Jackson Hole paper, backward engineers what such evidence would have to be. So we should look at SIFIs. What are SIFIs? SIFIs are financial intermediaries of size and strategic position for which an adverse shock will lead to a fire sale crash. Fire sale crash, to remind you, is a vicious cycle of forced sales of assets that lead to declines in asset prices, which trigger further declines in forced sales of assets. Now, such danger zones come from managers who take on tail risks, and they do so for 4 reasons. First, to artificially increase their current reported profits, to gamble for resurrection after an adverse shock, because they have made miscalculations and because they're too optimistic. So in each of these cases, these managers, what do they want to do? They want to hide their positions. So that means that the second mode of permissible research, statistical analysis, will be limited. The data is rare because it only involves those tail risk SIFIs. But it's rarer still because the long-term capital managements and the Casanos and the Skillings, they need to hide the vulnerabilities of their positions. This means that a less simplistic view of theory and a more forensic view of what constitutes evidence is needed to predict where the next crisis will be coming from. And this time is different. Reinhardt and Rogoff suggest that we actually need such analysis. But economists have limited incentives to see where, how, and when such a crisis would come. So let me say a few more words. The occurrence of sins of omission in economic research as the result of multitasking biases should not come as a surprise. Peeling the onion back one layer further, two theoretical papers show that scientists' desire for conformity will result in specialization of scientific belief. Those beliefs include views, such as we have been discussing, on the appropriate methodology and content of research for the respective field. So there's a nice paper by Brock and Akerlof who has shown that convergence of belief occurs with great generality. It occurs as long as subsequent generations of scientists shade their beliefs to conform to the beliefs of the previous generation. And there's a recent paper by myself with Pascal Michiat that has modeled conformity more specifically on the biases scientists express in promotions to tenure. In the model, such promotions committees favor candidates of the same beliefs as themselves and disfavor those with different beliefs. In this system, there's also long-run convergence of belief. Proper research methodology then converges to the following: do what I do, okay? Thus, the rigidity of belief regarding what constitutes research in economics, as articulated in the multitasking model, is predicted strongly. It's the equilibrium outcome. It's the equilibrium outcome of the system of promotion and publication in the academic profession. Okay, so conclusion. I've given you two examples that are mainly from my own research interest regarding sins of omission. I'm sure that everybody here at each of your tables will have your own examples of sins of omissions, of things that somehow you wouldn't know how to write a paper on that topic, and yet you knew that that is an important topic. So I think this is where INET, thank you, is playing a huge role in economics going forward. So what is INET doing? INET is expanding the domain of what economic research should be. So I think everybody in this room, and perhaps myself more than anyone else present, is very grateful to INET. And I must say, we're extremely grateful to Rob Johnson for his truly extraordinary personal and selfless dedication to this task. So thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Rob. I don't know where he is, but thank you.
Okay, Jim Heckman is our next speaker.
Oh, okay. Can't really see. Here, let me move this over a little bit so I can see my own talk. So I'm going to talk about some facts that sort of put some flesh, empirical flesh, on the concerns, I think, of this entire panel, and talk about the way we promote and reward economists. And I use the term the curse of the top five because it is, wait, there should be 12 minutes. I only got 10. I'll keep going, okay. So, whoops, and also this is not moving. Why isn't it moving? Can somebody help me advance it? Oh, here, okay, yes, okay, I got it. You have to point it this way. So really, let me just summarize what my main message is. I mean, there's something called the top five, which guides, I think, the careers of many people here in this room, especially the younger scholars. The top five itself is determined by citation counts, and publication is an important gateway to tenure and promotion. So it's an avenue of how the profession evolves. And I think understanding that, how it evolves, is and what the practices are really important. So I want to talk about this practice and what, if anything, should be done about it. The whole idea of evaluating fields on the basis of, or scholars on the basis of the journals in which they publish, is a fairly recent development. The last 30 years started really in biology, and I'll just let you take a look at these quotations. By the way, The whole entire talk is available if you just write me or write Tom Ferguson, I guess, the whole, for this. So the point is that in this field, in this topic, the journals that are considered important journals are basically those that, where there are a lot of other people reading the journals and other citations are present. So the danger is that when a publication is evaluated by the citation factor, it's not really evaluating the article on itself, but its company, the company it keeps. And so it's really kind of an odd process if you think about it. And it's exactly as George was saying, that this produces certain distortions. If you give people a reward, they're going to go in that direction where the reward is. And I think in our profession, that's a huge issue. So I'm going to just give you what the top 5 are. The top 5 are influential, I want to argue, but they're far from the sole source of influence or outlet for creative economics. And so here are the top 5, if you haven't seen them. So for those who aren't directly in academic economics, the top 5 are these items here on the left: the American Economic Review, Econometrica, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Review of Economic Studies. And then there are other journals that are general interest journals, and then a whole series of field journals. And as we move down this list, this is considered further and further from the frontier and further from what is high quality research. And so if you look at what the top 5 is and what the ranking is, just in terms of citations, you'll see that the one journal that's the most influential is not even on the list of the top 5. It's a Journal of Economic Literature. And a lot of the journals, some of these, Journal of Finance is another issue, where if we just played the game purely by citation alone, we would actually find that the top 5 is really not the top 5 in terms of where citations occur. But I think the concern about the curse is real. And we've done a number of discussions, which I'll just summarize, a number of analyses of tenure decisions and time to tenure at American universities. So we've surveyed a lot of scholars, we have a lot of journals. I'll just summarize a very extensive study. So there's a strong influence of top 5 publications on tenure outcomes. And the rest of the publications off the top 5 are really playing a fairly weak role, not only in time to tenure, but the probability of ever getting tenure. So this, for example, here, look, departments, the top 5 departments ranked by, I guess it's U.S. News and World Report, pretty arbitrary, but nonetheless, stay with that. This is the rate, the so-called hazard rate, the time to tenure, and how long it takes, for example, and what the rate is, and what the benefits are of publishing one paper, just at least one paper in the top 5. And the big black curve on top, you can see, in top 5 is much bigger, separated from the dashed curve below. And this is a pattern that appears. If you look at the other publication ranks, the tier 5, the so-called general interest journals, and publication in those journals doesn't really separate who gets tenure and who doesn't, at what rate. And if you go down the pecking order in terms of departments, you still find this true in departments ranked lower than the top 5, so 6 to 15. And you still see a bit of a separation, but as you move into the lower ranked departments, then tier 5A, which is the good field journals, are playing a stronger role. But still, the top 5 is very dominant. And again, this is just kind of saying the obvious, that if you publish in the top 5, the probability of getting tenure in the first spell of untenured tenure track employment is much, much higher. And again, that separates out. So if you look at the general interest journals, publishing in any of these others is just not going to give you much and this is certainly true in the top 5 ranks. If you look at the departments that are second tier, if you will, 16 to 25, then publishing 2 top 5s is really what it takes. But there really is a hierarchy, and the top 5 is playing a major role. So since I have to move on quickly, these are all available. But time to tenure plays a huge role. The top 5 plays a huge role in sorting people out. But then I raised the question, is the top 5 a good productivity measure? And remember, the goal itself, so I'm not even challenging, and I would think one should challenge if citation is the right measure. But I would argue that even in its own terms, the top 5 is an inadequate measure. And I'll show you some interesting statistics. So the top 5 is the shaded area. This is the distribution of log citations for articles published. That's a log scale, and you see that the median is pretty high, 4. You take e to the 4th, you're getting about 150 citations. So here are the various top 5 journals. You can see, and the whole average is lumped together in the shaded area on the left. But if you look at the general interest journals, these are articles published in 1996 as cited in 2016. And you can see that even there, 20 years ago, you can see that journals like the Economic Journal and the Review of Economics and Statistics, a lot of overlap in some of these other general journals. And if you look at even the field journals, there's a tremendous amount of overlap about where the citations are. Now, if you go to a more recent measure about articles published 2005, then you can find that actually the Economic Journal and Review of Economic Statistics, which for many people is sort of falling off the cliff into a non-tenured limbo world, or maybe hell, the underworld, is actually cited just about equally well with many of the top 5. So even by our own internal citation counts, we are actually, not really being consistent with ourselves. So QJ plays a big role. Now we ask, well, if we ask what are articles published in the last 10 years by RePEc's top 10 authors, again, I'm using a citation account, RePEc, what you'll find is, yeah, top 5 plays a big role, but it's also the case that a huge number of publications, even among those top-ranked scholars, are off the top 5. So by no means is top 5 a monopoly. And we have different ways to measure this. And Nobel laureates and so forth, you have to adjust for the volume. AER publishes probably about twice as many articles in a given year as the other journals, so that you have to adjust for that. So the articles on the right here, the graph on the right is showing that, the Brookings papers actually are one of the most highly cited journals, and that's way off the top 5 by any measure. And yet it's highly influential, at least is saying where people are talking about this, looking at Nobel laureates. And you can do the same thing for Clark Prize winners with a slightly different composition, but Brookings paper still plays a very powerful role. What I will also want to talk about very briefly is the ranking of journals. There's a kind of an internal inconsistency. If we go within fields and we look at scholars who publish within certain fields, and here I've taken, development as a field, econometrics as a field, finance, game theory, IO, and so forth. You can see the categories. What you see is the top 5 journals are shaded, but you can see the leading journal in each of these fields typically is not a top 5 journal. Where the action occurs is not in the top 5 journal. They're important, and they're differentially important across subfields in economics. But here I would say there's a fundamental contradiction. Here, what we're doing is letting specialists who themselves primarily publish in field journals are deferring to generalist journals to screen the quality of their colleagues, the people who receive honors, recognition, and tenure in their own profession, which is, I think, a bit. So the top 5, I guess, how much time? 2 minutes? Okay. So the top 5 accounts for a substantial portion of creative and highly non-cited work. I will just point out that some of the top 5 articles, if you look at the RePEc citation count, the most cited article, yes, it's Review of Economic Studies. So the first 5 look pretty good, but already the number 5, Lucas's paper, is not a top 5 journal. And if you go down the list, you'll see the Journal of Econometrics, Journal of Financial Economics, and so forth play a major role. So by no means, when we look at the effective ranking, where people are going, where they're looking to in their citation counts, that's, and of course, the top 5 ignores any citation to books. And with it then, that punishes scholars who are engaged in long-term publication programs that are really trying to do research. So here are some very influential books that are just off the top 5 charts. And so we can ask the question about, the percent of scholars' most cited publications. So here I'm looking at Nobel laureates and people who are highly cited. What fraction of their articles are published in the top 5? And you can see, just going down a list of people here. George, I think you're there somewhere, right? No, you're not. Sorry. Didn't mean to exclude you. This was done in haste. But you can see it varies a lot. So if you look for somebody like Richard Thaler, the recent Nobel laureate, only about, 30% of his papers would be published in the top 5. Al Roth, 70%. But it's not far from the majority of the papers. And there really are some extremely influential papers, highly cited. Here's Spence. I thought he was on the program, so I forgot you, George, sorry. But you can see a lot of his papers are actually not in top 5, and they're highly influential. Let me just then make one observation. the profession's reluctance to distribute gatekeeping responsibility to the non-top 5 journals is inefficient. And I'll take a figure from some recent work by David Card and Della Vigna, where you're seeing that the profession has grown over time. So what's happened is the number of submissions has increased, that's the dashed line, and the number of acceptances has actually decreased. So staying within this top 5, you're getting a bottleneck, and you're just simply not getting a reflection of what this growing body of work is doing. So there's a lot of work. The standards are getting higher, we're becoming more selective. And then I'd finally just say there's a danger here. And the danger is that many of the journals that are in the top 5 have very low turnover. And it varies. Here, this is just a distribution of the average length of tenure. Rystad has a policy. You have to leave every 4 years. QJE, you can see there's a very long tail. And other journals, JPE, some of the house journals typically have more. What that does is that it actually creates what I would call the potential for incest. It creates the sense, and I'm not going to say there's great bias. And so, for example, take my own university, Chicago. You'll see that if you look at the publications in top 5 by the work affiliation of the author, there is an overrepresentation in the Journal of Political Economy of Chicago people, either Chicago PhDs or Chicago. And the same thing would be true, for example, at the QJE. You'd find some evidence, for example, of substantial Harvard and MIT playing a very substantial, getting a very substantial contribution. If you combine Harvard and MIT, about 33% of the total publications. So that leads to some danger about this inciting, that what George was talking about. It's not deliberate bias, but there is just a natural sense that we're playing games, we're playing ball with people in our own thing. So let me just summarize. This is more of a factual presentation. I hope we discuss the long-term implications. But I think the top 5 is undeniably important. No doubt it is. It's not internally consistent, though, in the sense we do have very good predictors of citation counts that aren't on that. Like I mentioned, JEL is really the top-ranked journal, and the Economic Journal and Review of Economic Statistics is more or less on par with the top 5 in terms of citations. But the deeper issues are that it basically is not looking at the content of the journal. And it excuses faculty from reading papers and making tenure and hiring decisions. And as George said, it's really discouraging economists, young scholars, from taking on creative topics and doing journals. I mean, George is a living example, right? Your work, your fundamental paper on lemons floated around. And when it was first published, it was at a journal, when it was published, it was a journal that was pretty low down in the pecking order at that time. Now it has been elevated partly by the publication of his paper. So I think, though, that the idea of creativity is really stifled. And I think also one thing I've noticed in working in China is that many scholars working outside the United States want to publish in American journals. They see American topics. So I'll get frequently the topic, I can't work on China, even though people are fascinated with what's going on in China, because I can't get a QJE, a JPE, an AER. It has to be something on American data. So you get this irony of precious Chinese data being thrown away, a lot of problems simply because they don't think they can get it published there. And I think there's this question of centralization, which I think has serious consequences for the health of the profession. So thank you, and sorry for going over time. Here's that. Sorry, it took so long.
Thank you very much, Jim.
Wow.
And our next speaker is Carlo de Ippoliti. Maybe, Carlo, before you, one quick comment, which as you can see in that list of journals, I think I'm correct that there's no economic history journals in that at all.
No.
And you can thus see an almost hopeless position for a field that almost can certainly benefit by knowing a bit of its history.
And no books either, because economic historians will typically write a book.
Yeah.
And that's off the charts now, too. So.
Okay.
I had Fogel as one of the many people on the list. If you want to get this paper, I have a list of and you're on that list, I know for sure. Sorry about that. It just got omitted. I was very conscious of putting your name on the list, so I feel embarrassed that it got on. But Fogel published very few of his papers in these so-called top 5. And these are journal, and same with Al Roth and Vernon Smith. There were a lot of so-called marginal people who then later got very famous because the work finally caught on. But when they were young scholars, they would not have been successful by the top 5. So that's a huge.
Carlo?
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for inviting me. Well, in your introduction, you started by highlighting how economics is a very hierarchical discipline. There has been some research recently on this. For example, you can measure the hierarchical nature of economics by looking at how many women get a PhD in economics with respect to other disciplines, or you could look at the wide range of income distribution within the economics profession. That's another good indicator, I think. And then this very concentration also emerges when we look at citations. So for example, more than 40% of citations from top 25, not top 5 journals, points to another top economics journals. This is almost double with respect to what happens, for example, in sociology or in political science. So there is a very much a strong concentration at the top of the economics profession. And this has led some people to think about, or at least to inquire whether we are actually facing an old boys network or gatekeeping phenomenon as Jim Heckman was. No, wait. Is this what?
We have a clap.
Actually, I will first try to confute this theory, so if you allow me. So, for example, there has been a recent article published on the Review of Economic Studies showing that editors of top journals, which usually come from very, very few top economics departments in the US, tend to favor their former PhD students or their current or former colleagues, both when accepting papers or if we look, for example, the length of the papers that they accept. But I think there is an objection, as I just said. How can we be sure that, in fact, we are not talking about, to put it simply, the best economists? Why couldn't we, for example, argue that we are simply observing, the best people simply liking each other's paper and therefore accepting it for publication, or citing it when there are authors? For example, if you look at the distribution of citations, this is for Italy, but it's almost the same everywhere. There is a very large share of economists that are almost never cited, and very, very few ones who get hundreds, thousands of citations. So aren't they not the best? And is it just right that they, get this far very high share of citations? Well, I think it will be interesting, and that is what I'm doing in this working paper that's been recently published by NET, to compare this thesis with another one which could be equally credible in my view, and that is we are actually talking about people that personally know each other. To test this theory, I look quite far from the top. I took the case of Italy, which is arguably not in the top of most citation rankings, and I do not look at just a few journals or a few departments. Instead, I collected data on every single academic economist tenured at an Italian university in the last 6 years, and for each pair of authors, I tried to gather measures of their personal relationships. So you may have in my database measures of proximity, for example, how many papers these two economists have written together in the past, measures of, or for example, how many common institutional affiliations they have. As you will know, many people have more than one institutional affiliation. For example, in Italy, it is very common that people tenured in public universities will then teach at private ones, or they could be affiliated to any think tank, for example. Then I gathered a few measures of similarity of topics. This is done with a very sophisticated technique from information science. If you're interested into the methodological details, please look at the paper. And the number of journals in which both economists published. And then I also counted how many blog posts or newspaper articles, commentaries, or interviews these people have given in the same time range. Now, there are good reasons, I think, that to argue that given the highly polarized nature of the media debate in Italy, this could be taken as a measure of, let's say, similarity in terms of political ideology or political orientation. There are very tricky methodological issues when you look at pairs of authors, but if we just focus on the impact on the probability that one economist cite another one, what we observe is, for example, that having been co-authored in the past makes one economist more than 5 times more likely to cite their former co-authors than anybody else in the sample. Having written in the same journals make it more than 3 times more likely to cite another economist. And writing on similar topics has more or less the same impact of being affiliated to the same institutions. Then even writing on the same newspapers or web magazines has a small but statistically significant impact. In fact, that is also the variable with the higher standard deviation. So its impact is even higher than you observe in this graph. But what I think is interesting is looking at the joint impact of all these variables together. I mean, if we are talking about people that are affiliated to the same institutions, they may have worked together, they published in the same journals and often on very common topics. Well, in Italy, you would call them friends. Maybe in an Anglo-Saxon country, you could talk about colleagues or acquaintances. But still, I think that there are good reasons to think that citations measure something more and different than just sheer scientific quality. Well, but then there is another counter-argument that one could raise. These are all idiosyncrasies of any kind of pair of people that you could pick in my sample. Is it not likely that, for example, these idiosyncrasies just cancel each other in the aggregate? So I did another exercise, and I aggregated all citations that every economist, Italian economist again, received in my sample from anybody else in the sample. And I expressed this as a function of a number of personal characteristics. So, for example, being woman is associated with a lower average number of citations. This is very typical in most scientific disciplines, I must say. It's not special of economics. And then I also introduced a number of centrality measures in all those networks that I was looking at before. So again, the media outlet networks, the co-authorship network, affiliations, journals, and topics. And what I find interesting is that often many of these measures turn out to significantly increase the number of predicted citations that an economist receives at any year. But in particular, what turns out to be statistically significant is closeness centrality. Now, this is interesting because you could define the centrality of a person in a network in many ways. For example, you could count how many people does this person know. And this doesn't turn out to be so fundamentally driving the number of citations. Instead, what I found to be really important is how close are you on average to everybody else in the network. And we measure the distance by how many links, how many people are in between, the minimum number of people in between any two economists. So again, we observe that being very close to everybody else is fundamental in the co-authorship network, is very important in terms of affiliations, very important in terms of journals, and somewhat important, again, in terms of political ideology as well. What is not important is being central in the topics network. And this is also, if you want, relatively interesting because there is, in many disciplines, ample evidence that it does not really pay to be an eclectic writer, or, for example, interdisciplinary studies, on average, usually get a lower number of citations than very special topics or very specialized authors. So, on the whole, in the bibliometric literature, everybody has always said that citations at the same time measure both scientific quality and something else. The typical argument is that if the discipline works well, then, well, you could argue that being in a socially central position in network terms or in whatever terms you want is a reward for intellectual achievement. Instead, I think what the Italian data shows, but one could argue that, I mean, it's just an example, it's a relevant whole country for a case study, is that being there is also associated to many other things that do not have anything to do with intellectual achievement, such as one's gender, one's ideological positioning, and several other variables. So possibly, being in Italian, I'm a little bit too warm, and I should not be talking about friends, but at least one could argue that many people cite basically their colleagues and acquaintances. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. Our next speaker is Dr. Marcella Corsi.
My presentation is not there? Thank you. and Italy again, as you can see. And diversity is quite crucial. I mean, already all the presentation before me has stressed the importance of keeping diversity in our profession. And of course, I will also speak about pluralism in that sense. And why Italy? Well, of course, Carlo has already introduced our country. But actually, Italy, probably you know, it has a long history of pluralism and heterodox economics. So you wouldn't expect, I think, something what I'm going to show you now concerning the actual Italy and the actual Italian academy today. So, because actually Italy has become an example of how bibliometrics can become really a tool for censorship somehow, or in any case, a tool for discriminating against diversity and certainly heterodox economics. We have something run by the state that is very similar to what actually John Heckman has introduced you before. This is not just a matter of having an interview and discussing subjectivity about what is better or what is wrong. It's just that the state itself has decided that you are right and that you can go on in the academic profession if you respect some specific requirements. So how is done all this? Is done with this specific new system. It's called Abilitazione Scientifica Nazionale, ASN, as you can see. That is a system of evaluation for single researchers, but also for governing academic careers for promotion to associate and full professorship altogether. There is a committee of 5 members randomly selected. There are no interviews, no interaction with the candidates. Everything is done just mainly by bibliometrics. Economics actually is not defined by law as a bibliometrics sector, but as a matter of fact, it is. This means, of course, and I will show you in a second some results, there is really a risk of losing pluralism, the historical pluralism of our economic academy. And of course, in this risk, there is also risk of homologation between women and men. You know, if you were there yesterday, you know already that this is one main point of my analysis. Women and men tend to be different in terms of interest, scientific interest. Certainly they are different in terms of performance, in terms of productivity and so on. There are a lot of studies about that. There's no point for me to go in detail about what I mean. But let me just give you some figures concerning women economists in Italy. Definitely gender matters. There is an underrepresentation of women in university. This is a standard figure. At European level, you certainly know the SHE figures published by the European Commission. Only 36.5% of tenured academics in Italy are women, for all fields, of course. In economics, we are just 30.3. So, and despite the fact that we have 42.5% of women in PhDs. There is a gender imbalance in the academic position because less than 18% of full professors are women and more than 45% are assistant professors. There is a persistent vertical segregation with a classical pyramid for women, so a large basis made by researchers, then of course in the middle the associate professor, at the top the full professors. But if you look at the men careers, you find exactly the opposite situation. So all women are concentrated in the top, so in the full professorship. Then you have a smaller number, of course, among associate professors, and then a very small number among researchers. So absolutely the opposite kind of hierarchy structure. And then just to explain you very briefly, because I don't have the time to go in detail, but please read the paper and come to us. This work is actually carried out with Carlo and Giulia Zacchia, who's there. So we are ready to give you all the information that you might require. So what we have done is to build up a proper database, just taking into account all the candidates to the to the ASN, as I said, in the last 2 rounds, so which means 2012 and 2013. For each of them, we, of course, have taken into account all the information available on the website run by the National Committee for Evaluation of Research, so-called ANVUR, but we also explored a little bit more, introducing other information coming from the main data sets, like Akerlof and RePEc, or Google Scholar as well. I don't have really the time to go into details. But just to give you an idea of what are the differences in terms of women and men. Here you find the candidates for full professorship and the candidates for associate professorship. You can see the percentage of candidates who were actually qualified. It doesn't mean that they found really a position. It means that they can apply for a position. And this is another big problem, by the way. So 48.3% qualify for full professors, 47.7% qualify for full professor. But if you look at the women candidates, the percentage is absolutely lower, 31.6 for full professors and 39.8 for associate professors. As I said before, but I don't have the time, this is just to tell you what we have done. We have built an enormous data set, mainly thanks to Julia Zacchia, who did a great job on that. And we could actually explore more in detail their gender identity, their research interests, their publication habits. And the end of my presentation, I will give you some links for those of you who are interested in exploring a bit more the work that we have done. But just to give you again a quick view of what happened with the ASN. The ASN, basically, I told you before, there are no interviews, there is no interaction with the candidates. The 5 members of the committees just receive the publications and more or less read them. Of course, you cannot really check whether they read them or not, but they have to provide, of course, a proper report about each candidate. And basically, they have to look for the respect of 3 criteria. The first criteria concerns the number of monographs. The second criterion concerns the number of journal articles and book chapters. The third criterion concerns the number of articles in the so-called A-list journals. And of course, for our A-list journals applies most of what Professor Heckman has already said about the top 5. Of course, the top 5 are there for sure, but there are many more. But in any case, there isn't any Italian journal in that list. Or better, there is only one published by Springer. All the other historical Italian journals, and I'm speaking about journals in which published Nobel laureates, like Modigliani and so on, are not included in that list, just to be clear. But anyway, these are the 3 criteria. As you can see, women have performed better than men in that sense. 77% of women had succeeded in passing the threshold for the second criterion, and 74.7% in the third criteria. But still, if you look at the final result, and this is something that we had done with specific statistical tools. If I'm wrong, please, Carlo, correct me. This is actually done with a censored probit, introducing, of course, all the characteristics that we were able to pull in our data set, introducing also those information that I told you before from Google Books, Google Scholar, RePEc, Akerlof, and so on. Then if you test, and I finish with this just to give you an idea, if you test the probability of getting or being qualified in ASN, being a woman or being a man, if you try to qualify, or if you look at the qualification for associate professors, that is actually the line on the top, there are not large differences between women and men candidates. But if you look at the U-shaped curves instead that apply to full professorship, being a woman means that you are absolutely less favored in getting the qualification. And I'll leave you with this. Thank you so much. These are our publications.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry about that.
And Jakob Kapeller is our next speaker. Before he starts, though, one quick comment, which is when you see numbers or statistics and graphs like those last ones of Marcella, one hope we entertain at INET is that if folks think about suing in these different countries, the laws are different, different institutions, that some of this evidence might become relevant. It's a little hard to imagine that the whole profession will reform, but conceivably, it's happened that lawsuits have made institutions much more careful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, many thanks for having me here. I will talk about citation metrics and research quality in economics. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. And I would really be glad if you could put on my presentation instead of Kevin's. Also, I would be honored to present your paper too.
Maybe we swap?
Maybe we just
All right.
Maybe we just swap. It's easier.
All right, we will adjust. The mountain will come to Muhammad.
It's easier, no? We must
We'll
try.
do Kevin first, since there's obviously a problem with the order of the presentation.
Great, so my name's Kevin Young, and this is a paper that represents joint work with Lasse Henriksen and Len Seabrook, both at the Copenhagen Business School. This is part of a larger INET-funded project called Embedding Groupthink. The name of this paper is Fathers of Neoliberalism. So what we're trying to understand in this paper has to do with a historical question of the neoliberal ascent, whereby essentially a minority tribe within the economics profession eventually ascended to popularize a very, very important economic doctrine in the world. That's a story that's been told many times. Question of whether or not the neoliberal ascent happened is not in question here, but the how question, which has been examined in a variety of scholarship, looking at, for example, the importance of a variety of right-wing think tanks, or the importance of the elements of the business community mobilizing in the 70s. That story's been told. What we want to investigate in this paper is the professional practices and performances of economists over a multi-decade period leading up to 1985, when we feel the neoliberal ascent has eventually become consolidated. So our starting points are that neoliberalism had to replace an existing ideology. The battle over the dominant economic paradigm had to be struggled for socially and professionally. And this struggle, of course, took many different forms, but a very important part of that struggle had to do with what was going on within the profession of economics. What was going on within economics profession was absolutely critical, because the kinds of ideas that other actors used, whether or not they're later neoliberal politicians, or think of how the business community mobilized neoliberal discourse later, all of these ideas had to have popularity. More importantly, they had to have scientific authority, and they had to have a cadre of experts sort of waiting in the wings that could be called upon, especially when it came time to make adjustments to the ideology as it was developing. So our approach in this study is to examine economists' level of performance and aspects of their behavior, their professional behavior, historically over this period that we analyze. And we want to know very specifically, did neoliberals outperform their non-neoliberal peers in terms of publications, grants, or perhaps in terms of their career trajectories, in terms of moving into more government positions, or other differences in their career trajectories. Importantly for us, this is a story that we want to examine across generations. And so here's our analytical setup for this paper. We find what we call descendants, or children, of neoliberal fathers. So there we have Milton Friedman and George Stigler there. Think of their family tree. Think of all of the people that descend from them, all the PhD students they had over the years, as the sort of transition was happening in the 60s and 70s. We want to find attributes of the professional standing, both of these fathers and of their children, of their PhD students. And we want to compare that to we want to compare that to a comparison group that is similarly matched in terms of institutional prestige. In other words, the reproductive platform has to be matched from Chicago to something else. And how we did this is as follows. We gathered 13 what we call neoliberal fathers. There's some nice pictures of them, some of which are historical, some of which are more recent. So this is not every professor at the University of Chicago during this period, but these are people that are really pushing the free market line and were involved in this intellectual movement. are what we call Charles River Fathers, are economists of similar esteem and standing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that also made important contributions, but were from Harvard and MIT. The Charles River bisects the two institutions. So we have 13 neoliberal fathers and 13 Charles River Fathers. What we do then is try to find their descendants. So this is a network representation of the forward path in a genealogical network of all of Milton Friedman's students over the years. So this is his students and then his students' students going on. You can see that the effect can be, quite important if you supervise a lot of students. But we actually found that the RePEc data had a number of biases in it, sort of presentist biases, as it were, with respect to generating more elaborate family trees for more neoliberal-oriented economists. So what we did is we backtracked, and we took our 26 fathers, 13 from the neoliberal group, 13 from the Charles River group, and we worked really hard to find different children, different first-generation children of these fathers. We looked at a variety of different sources, from Fettschrifts and obituaries. We contacted university departments. We utilized some information from oral histories, as well as we visited a number of archives to do things like look up reference letters for students to get a sense of how these intergenerational ties were working. And we did a number of things to try to, this described in the paper. I'm going to go over this quickly. I'm going to show you some graphs so you believe me that we kind of balanced the data carefully and gathered a good number of students. Now, so we have basically two pools of people, okay? And then we start looking in the paper at performance metrics. So this is the mean citation rate, the historical citation rate. So not citations now, but citations that were flowing in at the time. If you look at the upper right-hand panel here, we're comparing the first-generation students of the neoliberal fathers to the first-generation students of Charles River fathers, folks of a more Keynesian orientation that were critical of the idea that free markets would emancipate humanity. And as you can see, there's not a big difference over this period, with a potential exception in the late 1970s on that upper right-hand panel, whereby the neoliberal children had some advantage. The big difference occurs among the fathers themselves. In other words, they were not able to carry this advantage over into the next generation in an interesting way. Starting in the 1970s, there's a big sort of citation ascendance of the neoliberal group. These series of plots are actually more important for us because these don't measure performance, but measure behavior. This is the in-citation rate, right? So this is the degree to which you cite within your own tribe, okay? So if you look at the upper right-hand panel and even the lower left-hand panel, the difference between students citing within their own tribe is not very great. So neoliberal children and Charles River children are sort of citing their generation at about the same rate. The big difference is, again, with respect to the fathers. So both the left-hand panels here are the rate at which students cite their fathers, okay? So there's a sort of paternalism effect or kind of ode to the father effect. It's much stronger in the neoliberal group than the Charles River group. They're citing back to their fathers at a much higher rate, about 3 times the rate as their Charles River peers at the time. We also looked at funding. We're unable to find any real clear, distinct patterns in terms of a simple funding rate, how often you publish something that was associated with funding across the 3 institutions that we studied. We also looked at the composition of funding. Now, there are very important think tanks and foundations and specific government agencies that played important roles, but in terms of an aggregate picture, the composition of funding is not different in terms of the sources. We also looked at mean grant funding in terms of just the amount of money you could pull in from the NSF, which is the one really systematic database we were able to get and gather. And the Chicago folks were not advantaged in some sort of environmental selection effect here in terms of acquiring more funding, nor does the effect take off over time as we observed it. We also looked at career paths. So this is an alluvial flow plot that just looks at the trajectory of these students out of these institutions and into different kinds of careers. Maybe it's possible that more sort of neoliberal children went into careers in think tanks and international organizations. We did not find this to be the case, and we looked at this in a variety of different ways. We looked at different government positions people had, and we also looked at high status and low status academia. We're unable to find a consistent pattern that we describe in the data. Now, this is a slide I've sort of been waiting for, and I'm really excited about. To the students in this room, who are now graduate students at the LSE, Elliot Jerry and Elizabeth Sullivan Hassan both contributed significantly to this network. What we did was we took all of the publications of all of these fathers and children from 1960 and 1980 inclusive. We took the acknowledgement sections, right? So this would be, Kevin Young, thanks Jim Heckman for the useful comments on the paper kind of thing. And this generated a large and elaborate network, which visually is almost impossible to interpret. But thankfully, there are network analytical methods that we can use. And by two methods that measure levels of social solidarity as these networks evolve over time, both transitivity and reciprocity is much higher for the neoliberal group than the other groups, no matter how we break it down. So reciprocity is really simple, right? It's like, I thank you, you thank me back, maybe in a later publication. We're helping each other. Transitivity is a little different. It's sort of like, I could know someone else sort of through you. It's more of a small world thing being picked up there. But these are measures of social solidarity, not of behavior, not of performance, that suggests that the neoliberal group was very solidaristic over the period of their ascent. So to conclude, the neoliberal ascent, we argue, has an important professional performance angle. When we compare these two groups in terms of historic, in terms of historic citations, there wasn't a clear pattern except for the fathers. In terms of external funding, there absolutely was no clear pattern. In terms of career paths, people didn't take career trajectories that were very off the mark from their comparatively matched peers. But in terms of in-group cohesion, we argue that social norms of reciprocity and what we call in the paper insurgent solidarity played a really important role in the neoliberal ascent. That's it. Yeah. And now, Jakob Kapeller.
Thanks. Thank you. Now, Jakob.
Okay, many thanks for having me here. I will talk about citation metrics and research quality in economics. I will try to address three issues. First, I want to introduce two views on research quality and reputational stratification in economics. Second, I want to ask how well can we really assess the quality of individual contributions. And third, I want to illuminate which signals play a role when it comes to the determination of publication decisions and citation behavior. Let's start with the two perspectives on citation data. That is something that was already subtly present in the other presentations. Why do we need two perspectives? The simple reason is that citation data is typically used in two different ways, either positively or normatively. A positive approach would be to employ citation data to analyze the properties of the scientific conversation or the development of scientific fields, and this is typically dubbed as cognitive scientometrics. The second approach to dealing with citation data today is much more popular. It is the idea to employ citation data to evaluate and measure the scientific performance of authors, editors, departments, journals, and so on. So we have a kind of evaluative scientometrics. And I would argue this is a really important difference because, for instance, if you look at a specific group of self-referencing people, you could say that from one perspective, this must be a group of highly talented geniuses, while from the other, it might look like a citation cartel. And in what follows, I'll try to explore this a bit with reference to the Big Five, a topic we already had. So what you see in this chart is the share of references in the top 5 that originate from the very same set of journals that originate from the top 5. And we believe this is an interesting measure of discursive concentration, and we find that more than 1/4 of references in the top 5, 27.5%, also originate from the top 5. Now, what does it tell us? To get a better grasp of whether economics here is really unique or exceptional, or whether this is something typical in science, we made a series of interdisciplinary comparisons. We compared the results from economics with those we get from studying sociology, political science, and psychology. And what we find is that these other fields have a much lower degree of discursive concentration, whereas the value for the big five was 27.5%. The value drops for sociology and political science to about 12%, and for psychology to about 8%. Now, when I present this to mainstream colleagues, the response I often get is that this has nothing to do with groupthink or discursive concentration. This is simply because the sociologists, political scientists, and psychologists have very lazy editors. And these lazy editors are weak in identifying high-quality contributions, whereas editors in economics have put in a lot of effort to select the papers with the highest merits. So we have, again, two different interpretations. One interpretation would be the cognitive one, saying that what we find is that economic discourse at the top is very concentrated and self-contained and reflects the general stark hierarchies in the discipline, whereas the alternative view, the evaluative view, would say that economics simply has a small set of highly regarded journals which are able to select those papers with the highest merits, and hence high-quality research is so easy to locate, and it's no wonder that it is intensely referenced. So taking this claim, we were interested in, does this really work? Could it work? Does it work, this argument, based on the thesis that we select the papers with the highest merits? To assess this argument, we built a small agent-based model. In this model, you have a population of authors. Every author produces a manuscript. Then there is a self-assessment of the manuscript quality on which a submission decision is based. A referee gets the paper, also makes an assessment, and then is the publication decision. And we have two variants of the model, one in which we have an ideal world and everything runs perfectly objective, okay? Every estimate of quality is accurate, every submission decision is objective. This is the one version of the model, and then we introduce a slight degree of error in assessments, in the self-assessment and referee assessment, and a modest dose of ambition when it comes to the submission decision. And what we find is that in our ideal world, we really have a perfect ordering of quality with regard to quality. We can perfectly order journals, whereas in the slightly less ideal world, we have 3 top journals standing out, and the rest is a volatile mess. We can find no clear pattern. Now, we can use this model to ask for the fate of top papers. So what happens really to the best papers? And in our ideal world, we find that everything is as it should be. So the purple line is the rejection rate, and then the x-axis you find manuscript quality, and we find that bad papers are rejected and good papers are accepted. Okay, everything is as it should be. However, in a less ideal world, we find that the rejection rate has a bimodal distribution. Very bad papers are rejected, but also rather good papers are rejected with a very high probability, and this is due to a bottleneck effect that arises due to the increase in ambition when it comes to submission behavior. So now what happens, what is the fate of the top papers in the ideal world? When we look at the 20% of papers with the highest quality, we find that all those papers get published, and most of them in highly reputable journals, okay? However, in a less ideal world, we find that of those papers with the highest quality, more than 40% remain unpublished at the end of the day due to the bottleneck effect already observed, and only about 55% get published, okay? So the implication of an agent-based model is basically that the argument that only intrinsic quality of paper matters is implausible. It does not even work in a next to ideal world where there are no fads, no fields, no social networks, just slight errors in the estimation of quality and a bit of ambition when it comes to making decisions about where to submit a paper. So when we find that only intrinsic quality matters is implausible, we correspondingly find in the empirical data some indications that signaling plays a decisive role. And relevant signals that serve as a proxy for manuscript quality have already been discussed here. We have been informed that signaling social capital is important, so past professional contacts impact publication process. We have found evidence that signaling competence is important. We found some indications that the top 5 are cited because of their prominent position in the discipline and not necessarily because of the high quality of all the contributions in there. We find something that James Heckman has already shown, namely that PhD origin and affiliation matter, so origin is important, and we also find that membership is important. So where you belong to matters, and in this case, this refers to paradigmatic membership. So I wanted to tell you about something about signaling origin, and I've collected numbers on those institutions which are which have the greatest degree of representations in top journals, and these numbers are basically very similar to the numbers James Heckman showed. So what we find is that for the 3 top journals, AAR, QG, and GPE, more than the half of authors have their PhD from one of the top 10 institutions, and more than 1/3 of authors have their affiliation with these top 10 institutions. Let me go to my second example for a signal. I would argue that signaling membership is important. There is the long-standing finding that within the economics literature there's a certain prejudice against heterodox economic contributions. So paradigmatic origin is also a signal that is relevant when it comes to publication decisions and citation behavior. And the clearest evidence is simply if we compare the citation behavior of heterodox and mainstream economic journals, where we find that, this is on the right bar, that heterodox journals are quite open for mainstream input, but the mainstream journals are almost closed for heterodox input. So we find in our large-scale data set that only 1.7% of references in the database come from heterodox journals in the mainstream, whereas more than 98% come from the mainstream itself. So what we argue is that paradigmatic belonging, paradigmatic orientation is a kind of relevant selection mechanism. Again, this is the question, what does happen here? Is there a form of institutional closure going on, or is it simply the bad quality of heterodox economic research? And one way to assess this question, why is heterodoxy neglected, is it prejudice or bad research, is to look at those papers in the mainstream that actually cite heterodox work. So what you have here is on the x-axis the number of heterodox articles referenced within mainstream papers, and on the other axis you have the change in citation impact relative conditional on the journal. So, and what we find here is that basically mainstream research gets more interesting when it also incorporates heterodox references. And I would argue that this amounts at the end of the day to a self-contradiction of the evaluative perspectives. If really heterodoxy is neglected because it's so bad, then there is the question why the introduction of heterodox sources in mainstream works makes the latter more interesting. So, to wrap up, I've introduced 2 views on research quality and citation data. Is it all about quality or is it about social structure? I've asked, can we select paper purely on merits? We have seen this does not work even in an ideal setting. However, we found the perverse effect that many high-quality contributions are ignored. And finally, we find some indications that this kind of ignorance is not random. There is social capital, origin, signaling competence, and paradigmatic membership plays a key role. Many thanks for your attention.